This conference comes at a time when African countries are grappling with the trilemma of crippling debt, ravaging health impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the economic downturn occasioned by restriction measures. Specifically, in our context as a country, we are facing a hefty and multiplying public debt challenge. Kenya's public debt is at a critical risk. It has an unprecedented stock of public debt that stands at US $65.6 billion as at the end of 2020. Undeniably, the debt problem is an enduring, stubborn reality exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which calls for a new public debt architecture in the country. Efforts are therefore needed to collectively ensure that government is able to remain focused in its development priority, and so that we are confident that the economy is also going to respond and also be able to provide the necessary socioeconomic development for the citizens. This is therefore an initiative to bring together politicians, technical and civil leaders from Africa to deliberate and agree on commitments that safeguard the macroeconomic sustainability and equitable international development finance mechanisms towards the structural transformation of the continent into global powerhouse of the future, which is long overdue. Therefore, this particular day, we seek to build a political consensus for a new public debt architecture where African governments and their citizens are rule makers and not rule takers, where debt recovery policies are sustainable, accountable, and insulated from political capture. Specifically, the forum will seek to achieve the following objectives: a commitment that can safeguard the macroeconomic sustainability and equitable international development finance mechanisms towards structural transformation of the African continent into the global powerhouse of the future. It will also seek to establish the political consensus that governments can adopt for a new public debt architecture where government and her citizens are rule makers and not rule takers. We will also seek to bring out good practices to ensure that debt recovery policies are sustainable, accountable, and insulated from political capture, and therefore come up with actionable proposals which will inform debt recovery process in Kenya. This particular session is convened by the Institute for Social Accountability under the Okoa Uchumi campaign in collaboration with AfCoDD. This particular session will have an in-depth presentation on Kenya's public debt issue with additional focus on the issues, with a presentation from Dr. Njaramba on lessons from structural adjustment program and the way forward for Kenya. We will proceed with a panel of discussants, which will follow the presentation and will tease out the issues that will have been presented. At this particular juncture, I would like to invite the CEO for TISA, Ms. Wanjiru Gikonyo, to give us her welcoming remarks so that we can then delve into the conference. Karibu sana, Wanjiru.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And on behalf of TISA and the Okoa Uchumi Debt campaign, we greatly welcome this engagement with AfCoDD, which offers us the opportunity to engage with the regional dimensions of our country level debt work. It gives us the opportunity to reflect upon and align to the Africa We Want agenda of 2063. We also welcome this collaboration under AfCoDD, which is convened by AfCoDD. And AfCoDD championed the Africa Borrowing Charter process. The Africa Borrowing Charter process is one that emphasizes the need for transparency, accountability, citizen engagement towards sustainable debt. So this collaboration calls upon us to consider how the Okoa Uchumi campaign can both leverage and propagate the widespread application of the Charter by Kenya, which is critical given our position as a regional economic leader. Whereas Kenya has an elaborate public finance management and debt management framework, we have a policy, we have the laws, we have the reports. There remain crucial oversight and transparency gaps, which have unfortunately been abused in our context and contribute to our present public debt crisis. So as a regional leader, there's an imperative for us to look at how do we work together with regional partners so that Kenya can claim that position in a fuller way. We also welcome this engagement because it prioritizes dialogue with the political leadership towards debt restructuring and sustainability. In this regard, we welcome the presence of Honorable Shabir, a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Finance and Economic Management, who will be giving us political perspectives. Unfortunately, he's not on the program. We received his confirmation a little bit late, but we greatly welcome the perspectives that he will bring on this political side. That notwithstanding, we are very aware of the considerable work that we need to do to get the political actors onto the agenda, onto this conversation. We note that they are present at present. We have ongoing a bill that seeks to amend the Public Finance Act to institute to strengthen the independence of the Public Debt Management Office. There's a proposal to set it up as an authority. And the same bill seeks to make the approval of all debt contracts by Parliament mandatory. At present, Parliament only has to approve the debt ceiling, and any other engagements that the Treasury enters into is done without parliamentary approval. And this has been a major loophole and a gap in oversight in our debt management. So this bill proposes to seal those loopholes. Therefore, we are very aware that we have, nonetheless, with this particular process, we recognize that the process is spearheaded by a private member. It's not a government bill. It's not a bill spearheaded by the opposition. It's a private member. So as a coalition, we have a lot of work to do to ensure that there's political buy-in into this legislative process, more so because we are merely 12 months to the next elections, and the pre-campaigning period has started in earnest in Kenya. And therefore, these kind of legislative, big political conversations, need some good strategy for us to be able to get them taken up. We welcome this dialogue, which provides an opportunity to share our research and generate ideas on how to strengthen debt in driving our development. In this regard, our main presenter, Dr. Stephen Jaramba, will present some of the findings and recommendations from a study that we are in the process of concluding, a study which focuses on the IMF-sponsored fiscal consolidation program in Kenya. Our study identifies some of the strengths of the program, but also brings out key gaps of concern, which underline the fiscal consolidation program.
Shiru, we can't hear you. You're muted. Shiru, we can't hear you. Kindly unmute.
Sorry about that.
Shiru, you're muted again. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I'll repeat again. We welcome this dialogue, which provides the opportunity to share our research and generate ideas in driving debt and development. Our main presenter will share some of the findings of a study conducted by the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, and a study which focuses on the IMF-sponsored fiscal consolidation program. This study identifies the strengths of the program, but also brings out key gaps underlying the fiscal consolidation program policies. Some of these include differences in our analysis of the debt problem and the resolution, especially with regard to the measurement of debt sustainability, which we feel in Kenya is not using the correct data and is therefore understating the problem. Another big gap is the view and use of taxation. In our view, Kenya's taxation has reached a point of diminishing returns and is killing business growth and revenue generation. We welcome the IMF's openness to dialogue, and it is our hope with our continued dialogue and political engagement in the coming months, we'll be able to resolve these critical issues. Lastly, we welcome this dialogue, which seeks to build a national civic movement beyond the present debt crisis. This is important when we recall the unfulfilled aspirations of the African Charter of 1992, which made...
Shiru, you're muted again.
So on a final note, we welcome this dialogue, which seeks to build a national civic movement beyond the present debt crisis. We recall the unfulfilled aspirations of the African Charter of 1992, which made undertakings similar to those of Agenda 2063. We therefore call upon AfCoDD, all the partners on this platform, to ensure that we go beyond the talk, we go beyond the communique, to an action plan, to a roadmap between this and successive conferences to ensure that our resolutions are implemented. Thank you very much for your time, and I'd like to hand over to Valerie. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Shiru, for that informative background. And at this juncture, we won't waste any time with that information. Let us delve into the presentation by Dr. Njaramba. Dr. Njaramba, the floor is yours. Karibu.
Thank you, Valerie. Good morning, everyone. And Wajiro, I think that was quite an overview. Thank you so much. For the presentation, I'm going to have it structured in 3 ways. I will have the Kenya debt situation presented as the first issue. We look at the overview in terms of where Kenya is in terms of its debt situation. The second section, of course, we look at the structural adjustment programs, more so on the lessons that are left to our country. And finally, we look at some of the recommendations highlighted. So as a way of introduction, once we are talking about public debt, public debt, it has actually been taken as a bad thing, but not fully a bad thing if it is utilized in the right way. But in terms of definition, of course, this is the amount the government accumulate over time over and above its revenue corrections. And it is mainly incurred due to what we call revenue shortfalls, or basically that the government or the public sector goes above in terms of its expenditure. The public sector experience expansionary growth in terms of its expenditure. We have various types of public debt, but the major categories are two. We can talk about domestic and foreign debt. But due to time, probably we may not go to a critical looking at the various types of public debt. Public debt can actually be useful to an economy, and also it poses a number of risks. One is that if the public debt is properly utilized, then it can be used to bridge the gap between the capital supply and the capital demand. If an economy is having capital deficiency, then it can make use of debt to accumulate the capital, and therefore able to boost its production. Number two, also public debt can be utilized in case of economy downfall. If an economy is experiencing what we call a recession, emanating from the fact that private sector aggregate demand is on a decline, then the public sector, government in this case, is called upon to increase its expenditure, mainly through public borrowing, in order to bridge that gap between the actual or the optimal aggregate demand and the existing aggregate demand. So the public sector is therefore called upon to increase its expenditure through borrowing in such a situation. But again, it is only useful if it is prudently employed. And this is to say, therefore, the public borrowing over time, which then becomes public debt, poses both a blessing and a curse in the same measure. So the risk involved in this public borrowing and therefore public debt, in terms of domestic borrowing, it has a possibility of crowding out or pushing out private investors or private borrowers in the sense that the government comes in and compete with the private sector. In terms of foreign borrowing, then the debt poses balance of payment problem. It poses currency risk and generally financial instabilities. Now, looking and mainly focusing at the main issue of the day, that the Kenya public debt. The fact on the ground is that Kenya is getting into debt crisis. Kenya is getting into public debt crisis. By the end of the year 2020, the debt stood at 69% of the nominal GDP. And I want us to note the word nominal GDP because we already have queries in terms of how it is measured. And there is a belief that the nominal GDP we have could actually not portray the true picture in the ground. So the currently, not currently, but by the year 2020, so far it has surpassed 69%. So by the year 2020, end of year 2020, from the data, of course, gotten from the Central Bank of Kenya, the public debt stood at 69% of the nominal GDP. This debt has been brought about by persistent fiscal deficit in the public. Also, it has been identified that between the year 2013 to the year 2020, the period at which the study focused on, there has been a major growth, exponential growth in this public debt. And the fact is that the fiscal budget has been far above the general revenue in the public. The actual budget deficit therefore increased from 558 billion in the fiscal year 2013-2014 to 1.36 trillion in the year 2019-2020 fiscal year. This accounted to about 143% increment, or in average over the year, we would say that then the public debt was increasing at 17% per year. Now, the deficit is therefore identified further by the fact that there has been a more deficit in the recurrent expenditure as compared to the development expenditure. This is by disaggregating the expenditure, the public expenditure, into development and recurrent. And what the study discovered is that the recurrent expenditure increased from 1.02 trillion to 2.45 trillion in a period of 7 years, which is a representation of 70% per annum growth. So the figures, maybe in terms of the trend presented in this table here, from the year 2013-2014 fiscal year to 2019-2020 fiscal year. And therefore, you find that the recurrent expenditure has two components. Of course, the study did two kind of approach by looking at the beginning of the budget. And remember, the beginning of the budget is the period at which there has been even the public participation and all that before the budget is adopted and read in the parliament. Of course, versus or compared with the actual expenditure, that is by then the end of the fiscal year, what is the true picture? And you find that if we look at the recurrent, the trend in terms of budgeting, there was a movement, there was an expansion from 1 trillion, to a figure around 2.3 trillion. That is for the planned budget, while the actual or the realized budget moved from the figure 1 trillion. You can see you can see the difference in terms of the planning and the actual implementation in the recurrent expenditure. And also, if you compare that with the development expenditure, the development expenditure shows budgeted figures, which in most of the cases then are lower than the actual. Most of the cases, they are lower than the actual figures. And the information here is that, of course, a number of activity or projects either burst their budget over the fiscal years or were not planned altogether. So the reason why you can find a situation like, for example, in the 2019-2020, the actual development budgeting was 652 billion, but the actual expenditure was 808 billion. Just could question the difference between the planning and the actual implementation of the same. So the total budget, therefore, shows a major difference, a major gap between the budget and the actual expenditure. So we have the growth as projected, moving from the actual expenditure from 1.5 trillion to 3.2 trillion in the fiscal year 2019-2020. So the recurrent balance, a very worrying picture here by the fact that the recurrent balance is an indication of going beyond the normal operation of the government. The normal government operations versus the revenue that is raised. And it shows that over the years, that is from 2013 to 2014 fiscal year to 2019-2020 fiscal year, there has been persistent deficit in the recurrent expenditure. That is not even saying that the development expenditure is yet not financed from the approach we have here. The actual budget deficit, of course, projected with the planned fiscal deficit, again, it shows the difference. In this column, in this row showing a budget deficit, note the planned deficit over the fiscal years, and you compare that with the actual deficit. And then the question comes that are we implementing the budget as passed by or through public participation, and therefore read by through the parliament and passed by the parliament? All along the way, this gap shows a major difference, and therefore question the need of that vigorous process of taking the budget or planning through the fiscal year, and therefore passing the budget through the process of public participation. So again, we compare the case of deficit and of course the GDP, and here I bring the GDP in two forms: the nominal GDP, mainly the one presented to us, and the real GDP. And again, I want to say that there is a major difference. Major difference. If you look at the nominal GDP and the real GDP.
Carry your 15 minutes into your presentation.
Sorry. I need to hurry up. Sorry. Yeah? So then again, if we do to the comparison between the nominal GDP, real GDP, and then project our public debt as a percentage, and remember that this public debt as a percentage of GDP is without the interest payment. The public debt here, which is then compared as a percentage of real GDP, is without the interest payable to them, and therefore you find that the actual picture is that Kenya is at 144% of the real GDP in terms of its public debt. Of course, these ones shows the information basically coming from that table, that from this financial year, the recurrent expenditure account over 70% of the budget, which is against the law. Of course, the law states that the development expenditure should capture not less than 30% of the fiscal budget. There is a widening gap between the budgeted and the actual expenditure, of course, bringing the question of planning. There is a growing recurrent balance financed that done through borrowing, again against the law. There is a big difference between the real GDP and the nominal GDP. This needs to be interrogated, how it is emanating. It doesn't make sense in terms of that difference. Then it's also noted that the servicing of this debt at the moment stands at over 55% of the public revenue. 55% of the public revenue goes to paying public debt. Now, for Kenya to manage the debt, then it has to grow its economy. And of course, the economic growth is quite important in all aspects, not only when it comes to the payment of the public debt. The economy needs to grow in order to improve the welfare of the population. It needs also to grow for purposes of catering for the upcoming population. And therefore, the growth in it is quite important in showing the capacity to pay. Of course, projected the green line and the yellow line, you find that over the year, there have been quite a difference. And early enough, seems that looking at the green as annual nominal growth of GDP, sometimes the economy was doing so well, and no wonder the question of public debt was not coming into focus. But looking at maybe from the year 2010, the situation was mixed up to 2012, but now from 2012 onward, it's a consistent decline in terms of annual nominal growth of GDP, and of course consistent in terms of average. The growth in public debt has been on increase. Of course, this is risky. This is risky, and of course, I want to bring the fact that, of course, we have I'm getting disrupted by the noise coming from the background.
Sorry about that. It will be looked into.
Fine. So we are also now focusing after discussing the question of higher growth in public debt in comparison with the economic growth, then we go to look at what actually is the composition of public debt. And we find that in terms of domestic and foreign public debt, the growth in domestic debt has been 202.5% for the period 2013 to 2020, while that of foreign debt has been 316.8, or in the same period. Want to bring to the focus that domestic debt does not pose that major threat, other than the fact that it competes, the borrowing competes with the private sector. The condition of it would actually be dictated by the movement in interest rates. But in terms of the foreign debt, this actually is an indication at times of export of domestic wealth or domestic income. So foreign debt from the year 2016 has increased more than domestic debt, and currently, or by the end of the financial year 2020, is stood at 51.2%. So the figures are as projected here, and from the fact that, again, at the end of the day, we have the decomposition of this foreign debt in terms of the multilateral debt, bilateral, and commercial debt. Of course, commercial debt is more expensive. It's more expensive, and it poses more risk to the economy as you compare to the multilateral and bilateral. So increasing external commercial loan could actually be risky to the economy owing to the cost attached to it. This in Kenya has been happening over the recent time, especially due to the issuance of the Eurobonds. The Eurobonds ones, I think, up currently to the fourth one. So in order to pay this loan, then the country needs to earn foreign currency. The earning of this foreign currency is through exports, the FDI, and also remittance into the economy. But however, this has been on decline over the time. And this has left the country, therefore, only to further borrow in order to pay for foreign for the foreign debt. So then the question on what has actually brought this demand for foreign currency, of course, the only time that a country requires foreign currency is when it wants to pay for its imports of goods and services. So the demand for imports, into the country was also brought into focus, and it was found that Kenya over time has becoming uncompetitive. There is uncompetitiveness of domestic production with foreign goods. And then the question of monetary policy came into focus, and it was noted that over time, Kenya has made use of a very strong real exchange rate, that's making it uncompetitive in terms of its regional peer or the trading partners. And from this figure, it was noted that the monetary policy has done so well to maintain the currency, the real exchange rate, as shown by the exchange rate line here. Just to maintain it stable, the monetary policy shown by the amount of money that is released, that is domestic money released to the economy. Over time, it has actually been growing, but the main function of it is to maintain or sustain the real exchange rate a bit stable. This one has been identified, the real exchange rate has been identified to be over and far above its the normal, or what we may call equilibrium exchange rate. And that it has done the worst to the economy by actually making sure that the trade balance is negative over time. The trade balance has been negative over time. And within the the last years, the competitiveness, I think from 2016 to 2020, it's even becoming worse. So Kenya is importing more, and by importing more, then it needs to acquire foreign currency in order to pay for those debts.
Shakir, 10 minutes to go.
Sorry.
10 minutes to go.
10. Thank you. I'll be done in the 10 minutes. Now I'm looking then at the structural adjustment programs and the lessons that learned from that. Kenya has over time asked for assistance, mainly from the IMF and World Bank on several occasions once it experiences the balance of payment problems. So mainly the reason why the government goes for the IMF rescue packages is because of the balance of payment problem it has experienced. these resources, of course, comes with the requirement that some adjustments are done, more so in how the public sector operates. There's commonly known structural adjustment programs. And you find that they all have, we've looked at the structural program from the time Kenya acquired independence up to the current one, 2020, the IMF Fiscal Consolidation Program, and we found that they all bear similar concept. These are budget rationalization, institutional reforms, reforms of the state-owned enterprises, and the monetary policy reforms, mainly, of course, control of inflation. Well, of course, while some have been successful, others has actually not done so well for the economy, or some of the recommendations have not been well for the purpose of the economy performance. So the government of Kenya has been noted, of course, over time to retreat from this commitment, especially once they acquire the resources. Two is that the export-led development did not work for Kenya, since they promoted mainly the primary exports, or what we may call goods that are not processed in the economy. So the primary and mainly agricultural outputs are exported, and therefore have not really helped Kenya in terms of boosting its balance of payment. The structural adjustment program, again, they have been anti-poor. They've been noted that they've worked mainly against the poor people by the fact that most of the recommendations have been to eliminate subsidies and cutting on expenditure, and that has gone far, mainly into affecting the public support on education and health. Again, of course, a lot of information not provided to the public in order to make the public follow up and make the government accountable with them. So you find that the programs, the structural adjustment program, have been shrouded with a lot of secrecy. Again, this has made Kenya to be dependent anytime instead of looking into internal affairs and its own adjustments, then it goes and therefore calls for assistance, which then comes with the conditions and therefore follow external oriented programs. Again, there is also the encouraging expansion in borrowing. It's found that the structural adjustment programs have encouraged the government to continue expanding. The way forward emanating from the study, there's need to review the domestic foreign debt mix such that more debts then need to be denominated more in Kenya currency than foreign currency. They need to renegotiate the IMF-related conditionalities. Some of the conditionalities related to monetary policy are maintaining the Kenya shillings very strong in terms of real term, and therefore affecting the purchasing power parity to the disadvantage of Kenya production. There is also a need to ensure over the same that the agreed upon conditions or fiscal consolidation programs are fully implemented. As a country, there is need to stop the defense of the foreign exchange currency. And where there is depreciation of Kenya currency, which promotes then export, of course makes import expensive, then it would be good also to accompany that by eliminating or reducing some of the taxes attached to the import on inputs. So the government should also move away from commercial loans. This was seen, if possible, should be eliminated to zero, and it is possible. Transparency needs to be seen from donor programs. This is by making it, even the documentation that they do, of course, normal public friendly in terms of understanding and also availability. Need for consistency in the way public debt is reported. Of course, there has been noted to be a lot of difference in data coming from Treasury, coming from central bank, and also from IMF. There is a lot of inconsistency in data. In addition, ensuring consistency of data across various government documents. And also attached to that is the improvement in forecasting and planning. The issue of proper planning that actually calls upon strict adherence to the plans and avoid the gap in between budgeted and planning. Government should also stop using external debt merely to fund public spending, which can in principle be either domestically managed or altogether reduced or done away with some of it. So the purpose of principles of good taxation need to be reassessed in Kenya to address their productivity. There is a question on productivity of taxation in Kenya. That issue of taxing purposely for raising revenue should be looked at, and of course make taxation more productive in the economy. Observance of the law and fiscal discipline need to be enforced. The law, of course, based on what the recurrent and the development expenditure requires, need to strictly be looked at. Strict observance of budget and minimize adjustment, or more commonly known as supplementary. Of course, this supplementary has become one too many, and they need to be, again, be looked at. Alignment of public expenditure to revenue and promotion of prudent spending by cutting on waste, and of course, looking at the non-priority expenditures. Thank you so much, Farari, for the opportunity.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Njaramba, for that very, very insightful presentation. By the way, Dr. Njaramba is a lecturer of the university, the Kenyatta University, and he's a renowned scholar and researcher who has published extensively on these economic issues. He's also a public policy specialist, and that has been demonstrated in his paper. And he has brought out critical issues that affect Kenya's persistent fiscal deficit, and therefore Kenya's public debt. And this he has very well elaborated, that is compounded by the fact that the debt is more on recurrent expenditure than it is on development expenditure. Now that poses a very, very serious problem in the economy. With all that he's brought out, he's also actually led us to the question that is actually critical to this particular event about the debt crisis. Indeed, in May 2020, and that is this year, the IMF downgraded Kenya to a high-risk public debt distress country. And this has very serious implications for the country. These crucial high levels of debt are, among other challenges, undermining the government's ability to be able to invest in development priorities. If we consider, like Dr. Njaramba has brought out, that 55% of public revenue goes to debt repayment, and in view of the fact that we are now dealing with a pandemic that is actually having a serious strain on the country's repayment, we actually then are able to see why we really are supposed to be very, very concerned and come together to be able to reason out and look at the way forward. Dr. Njaramba has also brought out the issue of public finance management concerns that he's actually very ably highlighted, that they go against legislation and physical discipline of the country. In view of what Kenya is faced with, Kenya has all the time asked for assistance from IMF and World Bank, and this has required adjustment on the public sector operation through the structural adjustment program. And while some of these programs have been beneficial to the economy, some have been very, very negative in terms of the impact, and especially on very critical service area that has continued to affect the majority of Kenyans, especially the poor, and again, among others, increased Kenya's dependency, which doesn't make any the scenario we are in any better for us. At this juncture, I think we will have to then allow our panelists to come in and be able to shed some light and give us their perspective from their positions. And in this regard, I would want to invite Mr. Rasmussen Tobias, who is the Kenya resident representative of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Mr. Tobias, as you come in to react to the presentation, I would like to pose a question that would then help us get to the achieve the objectives of the conference. And my question to you, Dr. Tobias, is considering the reducing revenue raising capacity of the government in the wake of the international and domestic impact of COVID-19 crisis, how appropriate can the dynamics around lending and costs and interest rates of public debt shape up? Mr. Tobias, the floor is yours. Karibu.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you also, Dr. Njaramba, for the presentation. So first, let me say, really glad to be here participating in this discussion. It's an important one. Debt is by nature so closely tied with economic development and really big, important trade-offs there. Also, I think at this current juncture with the pandemic, some of those trade-offs, tensions have become even more important, more pronounced. So all this just to say it's a really important discussion, and I'm honored to have this opportunity to participate. So Valerie, if I understand your question, it's really on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on debt dynamics. So let me start by offering some perspective on how the pandemic has impacted on countries in sub-Saharan Africa generally, and then I'll turn to Kenya. So first, I think one has to recognize that the COVID crisis has been a truly global shock. Has affected both wealthy and poor countries. At the IMF, we last month put out our most recent update of the World Economic Outlook. And the numbers there indicate that global output contracted by 3.2% in 2020. This comes against growth the year before the pandemic of 2.8%. So a drop of almost 6 percentage points. For sub-Saharan Africa, output contracted by 1.8%, and that was against growth of 3.2% in 2019. So a 5, almost 6% drop there too. In other words, sub-Saharan Africa, the economies there have experienced roughly the same decline in growth as the world overall. 2020, last year, was a year with unprecedented declines in economic activity across the world. If we then look at this year, 2021, we see growth rebounding. Sub-Saharan African economies are projected to grow by 3.4% in 2021. So this is slightly higher than the pre-crisis rate. What's important there, I think, is that even as economies are rebounding, activity is coming back, we're not making up for lost ground. On a per capita basis, output is not expected to return to 2019 levels until after 2022 across sub-Saharan Africa. And in many countries, it'll take considerably longer than that. Aside from the economics, also important to recognize that the crisis has been in many other areas, and it's really not primarily economic even. COVID-19 is a health crisis, and the priority for countries is to save lives. It has required containment measures that have come to a cost of economic activity that have been required to stop the virus, and it has required increased health spending. The focus right now, the priority, is rolling out vaccines. So coming back to the economics, the challenge for many sub-Saharan African countries is that increased spending requirements following from the COVID shock, as well as lower government revenue that resulted from that decline in economic activity. These come against the backdrop of already high public debt levels and limited fiscal space. Sub-Saharan African countries did not increase their fiscal deficits as much as advanced economies did. But debt, nonetheless, as a result of the shock, has increased by to almost 58% of GDP in 2020 across sub-Saharan Africa. That's the highest level in almost 20 years. And it's an increase of more than 6 percentage points in just 1 year. So public debt has shot up across the region. With the higher debt comes increasing debt service costs. This is reducing the room for provision of much needed services and much needed development spending. So in face of that debt burden, the general challenge for policymakers in sub-Saharan Africa will be to create more fiscal space. This requires domestic revenue mobilization. It requires careful prioritization and pursuit of efficiency gains in government spending. And all this, even as countries must deal with the cost and demands of the ongoing pandemic, they do need to undertake that fiscal consolidation to put debt back on a sustainable footing. It's a tough challenge. The international community must help also. One area is definitely with vaccines, where ensuring broad coverage is a global public good, benefiting everybody across the world. Another is financial support. At the IMF, we have been contributing with financial assistance to 85 countries with over 115 billion US dollars in support. One of these countries is Kenya. And just this week, we completed a 650 billion US dollar allocation of special drawing rights, SDRs. SDRs are an international reserve asset that is created by the IMF. This SDR allocation will provide additional liquidity to the global economic system, supplementing countries' foreign exchange reserves and reducing their reliance on expensive domestic or external debt. The SDRs are being distributed to countries in proportion to their quota shares to the IMF. This means about 275 billion that is going to emerging and developing countries, of which low-income countries will receive about 21 billion. Let me then end by saying a few words on Kenya. So first, I think it's important to recognize that the recent economic shock is not unique to Kenya, but is part of a global picture. That's what I described in terms of the developments across sub-Saharan Africa. And indeed, the decline in economic growth and the increase in public debt that Kenya experienced from 2019 to 2020 has been very close to the average across sub-Saharan Africa. The shifts that we have been seeing in the economy over the past year or so, accordingly, have to a large extent been driven by the pandemic and other external factors. A second point is that when we look at the debt challenges ahead, what the government's fiscal plan here involves is to balance the need for short-term support to the economy with medium-term consolidation to sustain confidence and gradually reduce the debt burden. This is the plan that the IMF is supporting with the 3-year program that was launched in April of this year. That arrangement makes $2.3 billion in low-cost financing available to Kenya. Third point, it cannot be emphasized enough that the fiscal consolidation plan in Kenya is the government's own plan. It is based on Kenya's own medium-term fiscal framework, as laid out in the budget policy statement approved by Parliament in the beginning of this year. The IMF supports that plan because we believe it is a good plan for Kenya. We see Kenya's economic plan as striking the right balance between near-term support for the economy and laying the ground for durable and inclusive growth for the years to come. Without such a strong multi-year approach to contain debt and reduce debt vulnerabilities, there will not be sufficient resources in the near term to support vulnerable groups or much needed higher spending in areas like health. So I hope that gave you a bit of perspective on how we see developments in the economy and how they relate to the debt dynamics. let me end there. Back to you, Valerie. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Tobias. Thank you for that very insightful rejoinder and response to the presentation. It has helped shed light on our circumstance and the thinking around that from our development partners. You have ably painted the fact that this is not unique to Kenya. I mean, the global picture presents a decline in economic growth across the countries, close to average in, and Kenya is close to average in sub-Saharan Africa. So while we are not badly off, really, it doesn't mean we are out of the woods, really. And therefore, we hear your sentiments that amongst other things, we need to look at our medium-term consolidation to reduce the debt burden, and also the fiscal consolidation plan, which is the government's own plan to that involved Kenya's fiscal policy, and which IMF really supports the plan as laid out this year. And that then just leads us to a very critical position where there's a need for us to look at our domestic debt. And I think at this point, then I would just invite Ms. Wangare Mukia, who is an economic expert and a PFM specialist, to actually then just bring out the aspect of domestic debt in the country. Karibu sana, Wangare Mukia.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and thank you for the presenters and the panelists for quite insightful information and really an expansion of what the situation on public debt in the country. I really wanted to take a closer look at domestic debt, because I think in much of the dialogue that happens in the public from the stakeholders is really a strong focus on external debt. The sustainability of public debt in Kenya is really a hotly debated issue. And I remember last year, Kenyans expressed anger at the continued government borrowing, even at some point starting a petition to cancel the IMF loan to Kenya. But the debate on public debt in Kenya is usually anchored on the public debt to GDP ratio, which in 2020 stood about 65% and definitely has gone higher since the COVID pandemic. And many argue that the level of debt has increased to dangerous levels, and the government needs to rethink fiscal sustainability overall. Now, public debt has increasing since 2011, and by 2020 had reached the 2001-2002 level. And now this is really quite worrying because pre-2002, that period was characterized by very low economic growth. Now, a high public debt also implies that expenditure to retire the debt is also increasing. Now, government expenditure on government interest payments, which is something I think that is a key discussion when it comes to debt, because interest payments are actually cut into the annual budget, the revenues that need to meet the obligations of the annual budget. And if you're paying high interest rates, it means we can only afford less and less good activities, goods and services to finance, economic growth and activities for that year. And so government expenditure on interest rates has been increasing. And in 2000, if I can give you some sort of mute, thank you. In 2000, about 17 shillings out of 17 shillings out of every 100 shillings went to interest rate payments. And by 2002, it had increased to about 26 shillings. So about a quarter of our total revenue is going to finance interest payments on public debt. Now, I know the paper that was focused on and shared and presented during this presentation largely focused on external debt, since it's not owned by Kenyans and it faces exchange rate risk and volatility. But the neglect of domestic debt discussion has led to several developments in the domestic debt market that are undesirable. So first, domestic debt has seen tremendous growth since 2002, between 2000 and 2020. And the ratio of domestic debt to GDP increased by 20% in 2000, from 20% in 2000 to 33% in 2020, compared to external debt ratio, which declined from 42% to 36% in the same period. And so the position has always been that there's no reason that we should be concerned about domestic debt, since the borrowers and lenders are in the same country and there's low exchange rate risk. However, there are several downsides to domestic debt, and I'll highlight two of them. First, because of financial globalization, it makes it very likely that many of the lenders that acquire domestic debt might be external. Now, if you look at the different banks in Kenya, even think about the bank you bank with, it's likely that the bank you are banking with is not a Kenyan bank. It's a foreign-owned bank. So while the currency is, we escape the exchange rate risk from having domestic debt, the funds may not necessarily be capitalized in Kenya. And so there is that risk where the money is being invested domestically, but it's going out because the banks that are investing are external banks. And second, the domestic government borrowing affects the size of the credit available in the country, as mentioned by Jaramba, and the lending interest rate. So for a government to borrow, it needs to offer a competitive interest rate, right? And this implies that the government borrowing leads to higher interest rates, which increases the cost of acquiring funds to finance investment by business. So low investment in private sector implies low job creation, low growth, low productivity, and low consumption. In addition, domestic borrowing is expensive compared to external borrowing, and I don't think this is a point that people are focused on. Our analysis at the EGCL Institute has shown that although the share of domestic and external debt in Kenya are about equal, the share of interest payments on domestic debt in total revenue is more than twice of that of external debt, more than twice. So interest payments overall is about 50% of our budget, which means we cannot grow our economy as fast as we would like. And I also realize this as I'm saying this, that we do accept that without the debt, we may not have been able to invest in key infrastructure to grow our economy. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario. But the issue is, where is the balance? Which of our activities have we borrowed against? Good time. Right? How fast are we able to pay back the loans? And which investment have we taken that can actually help us support paying back this debt? Right? So taking you back to the 26 shilling example, out of the 26 shillings, 19 shillings of our interest payments is going to pay off domestic debt obligation, and 7 shillings is going to pay off external payments. Like I said, this is money that we could be using to finance our budget and to grow our economy, but most of the money that we're generating in revenue is going back to pay interest domestic debt obligations. So it's clear that the public outrage on the level of public debt is not unfounded. Let me make that clear. But although the public debt to GDP ratio is crucial, it is also important for Kenyans to understand that the public debt is either paid by increases in taxes or a reduction in revenue. And this was also highlighted in the paper and the intervention from the IMF, which are encouraging us to, at one point, to increase the tax base, but also to reduce it. We're ramping up tax revenue by increasing either tax hikes or increasing taxable activities, as is included in the IMF proposals. So the level of public debt in Kenya is also likely to impose real welfare costs in the economy by reducing the level of investment in the private sector. And domestic debt tends to mask the amount of credit available and increasing the cost of borrowing. So At a time currently where 18% of the businesses in Kenya are citing lack of finance as a major obstacle, the government should rethink its borrowing in the domestic market. Kenyans need to have a discussion whether it is wise for the government borrowing in the domestic market to continue, or there should be an annual ceiling on domestic debt to GDP ratio. And this policy can ensure that the government does not overborrow in the domestic market, which results in crowding out of private investment and lowers future economic growth. And this was a subject of a paper that we have currently written on whether domestic borrowing either crowds in or crowds out private investment. And we found that the threshold for annual domestic debt borrowing before it crowds out investment is about 3.72 annually. And under 3.72, it leaves room for more investment. It's actually, there is space for investment to crowd in private investment. But over 3.72%, it actually crowds out investment. And if you'll allow me to really just share my screen briefly, I should be able to show you that image, although I'm not sure I have ability to do that. But anyway, all in all, while our external debt has increased significantly, we cannot afford to turn a blind eye to the domestic debt and what the consequences of this debt for our budget and overall economic growth is for the country. So thank you. I will hand back to Valerie for additional discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much, Wangari, for that eye-opening presentation. You have ably helped us look at what, consider why we should look at the domestic debt and do that very critically. The truth is the sustainability of debt in Kenya is a sensitive issue, and many have argued that the level of debt has risen, and it is actually point of concern. You brought out the downside of the domestic debt issue in the country. And among those, the issues you brought out is the fact that the funds are not capitalized in Kenya as banks are external banks. Now, this poses serious implications in the economy. And therefore, the more reason why we have to really, really look at the issues that affect domestic debt. You have also helped us look at the fact that payment of public debt would, among other things, impose welfare concerns. And definitely this has an impact on increasing inequality in the country, which has continued to be an issue. And this, for the most part, has a burden that is borne disappropriately by women. Now, this leads us to the next presenter, whose question largely would be on the issues the welfare issues that affect women. And at this point, I want to invite Crystal. And Crystal Simeoni is the director of the NAWI, which is AfriFem Microeconomics Collective Pan-African Movement, which is an African feminist initiative. And karibu sana, Crystal. My question to you, Crystal, is the restructuring of gender relations within the society is an important step not only towards promoting freedom, equality, and justice in favor of women, but also for ensuring that their participation in the development process is acknowledged. How then would we rethink politics, institutional, and policy framework that adopt new public debt architecture that catalyze women's effective participation to challenge approaches that increase inequality, whose burden, as I have mentioned before, is borne directly by women? Karibu sana, Crystal.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you, Tisa, for organizing this really amazing panel with such amazing people. I'm really honored to share space with all of you. My name is Crystal Simeone. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I lead and work with the NAWI Collective, which is a Pan-African feminist initiative working on macro level economic policy. And so you can imagine we have two very big but almost separate fights. We've got a feminist fight against the patriarchy, but we also have a Pan-African fight against neoliberal, neocolonial policies that continue to decimate our economies. I'll start off with the idea that, feminist economists for a very long time have been saying a lot of the things that we're talking about. Lucy Cavallero and Veronica Gago have argued that debt is a historical mechanism of capitalism used to loot, exploit, and privatize the commons that we create and recreate, as well as to increase labor exploitation in moments of crisis. Like you said, Valerie, most of the time, women bear the brunt of austerity measures, of debt measures, of economies falling to their knees in crisis like COVID. And it's important to also remember to link household debt with sovereign debt. And a lot of the time that link is left out. Debt and macroeconomic policy sometimes hides behind jargon and technicalities. Yes, there are technical elements panelists before me have gone into detail from a technical perspective, but really it is a political issue and one about power. Debt continues to show a power disparity, mostly between the global north and the rest of us, many a time between men and women and the genders. Some call, the global north and the global south, they may say, or sometimes formerly colonized countries, and that nuance is important to remember. But it's also important to remember what we're talking about when we talk about debt in the context of the economy, and what is this economy that we're talking about. Jason Hickel says the economy is ultimately our material relationship with each other and with the rest of the living world. And really it calls into question what we want as we design our economies, what we want as we design the relationships and engagements that we have with the economy at a household level, at a national level, at a regional level, and definitely at a global level. And so this session talks about debt, but also about the structural adjustment programs. And there's a song that says, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And weirdly enough, it feels like we're reliving the 80s and 90s of Kenya currently. We know this story all too well. Africa found freedom after we were colonized. Well, in as much as we thought we had control of our state, we thought we had freedom. And post-colonial administration seemed to be taking our newly independent countries into an era of prosperity. Newly independent countries had people-centered economic policies that were led by the likes of the great Sankara, Nyerere, and Nkrumah. And I can put a link to one of Sankara's speeches on debt that rings so true and might as well have been written in 2021. In as much as Africa seemed to be on the rise, we began to be crippled again by foreign debt. Sankara at the African Union Summit famously put it, if we do not pay, the capital lenders will not die. If we pay, we will die. We cannot pay and we don't want to pay. Sankara died shortly after this, and it's hard not to draw certain conclusions as to why. This continues to show Africa's centrality in a global economy and its continued place as a site of extraction and continuous extraction in different manifestations. The 80s and early 90s saw the structural adjustment programs, a range of neoliberal macroeconomic measures promoted by the World Bank and the IMF in exchange for financial resources. Kenya was among the majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa in which the SAPs were implemented with devastating effects on the delivery of public services stemming from cuts in government expenditure imposed on the public sector. And I say it reminds me, this 2021 reminds me of the 80s and 90s because just yesterday in the newspapers, or the day before, there's an article that says how, because of World Bank policies and in our borrowing, water is set to go up by 10 times, and this takes me back to an era where government public services were almost completely decimated. It's widely documented how the economic and social impact of the structural adjustment program very much so disproportionately affected women. The collapse of publicly delivered social services and infrastructure increased the unpaid care and domestic work burdens, and low-skilled public sector jobs, which mainly employed women, were lost. Again, it's the same today. User fee payments and cost sharing also fell very heavily on women. Again, it's the state of play today. In 2015, the world came together in Addis for the Financing for Development meeting, looking at how the gap in financing can be plugged to be able to realize the SDGs. Basically, out of that process, options for regions such as Africa for financing our development was either domestic resource mobilization or private financing. And this opened up a Pandora's box really for global private finance to find a way to the hearth of a developmental discourse. The World Bank's approach has seemed to dominate this discourse to what they call a maximizing finance for development. And some say that this MFD, or maximizing finance for development approach, has structured the bank's operation since about 2017. And its implementation is an indication of the institution's commitment to increase the involvement of the private sector in development. An important objective is to attract trillions of dollars managed by private institutional investors to help finance the SDGs. De-risking private finance is central to this approach, and moving our governments into a de-risking state is also central to this approach. In brief, this approach questions a country's ability to provide safe healthcare. Are there policies and legislation that act as barriers for private finance to come in and solve this gap? Then those need to be changed. And because of our country's economic status, it is risky to invest, and so governments must de-risk private finance investment to become as attractive as possible. It means guaranteeing a certain number of patients for a hospital, for example. De-risking against calamities, political strife, and more to make sure that private investment remains profitable. This means profit, thanks. This means profit is always chosen over people, and we must question this. It questions the social contract between state and citizen and shifts the contract to one between state and global private finance. And so I have a few questions as I end. I question the role of GDP as a measure of growth when it continues to show how problematic it is, when your GDP can increase the more you privatize, say, healthcare, for example. And so what is that as a measure of growth for our context with our history and our nuance? I also question what growth is, and we've been speaking about how Kenya needs to grow. We're not looking for growth for growing's sake. The Africa is Rising narrative showed us our economies can be growing, but only for a select few, and can be growing in a jobless way, in an empty way, and one where inequality continues to rise as well. It is up to us to reimagine what our measure of growth is, rather than continue to implement neo-colonial and neoliberal structures of economic modeling that definitely don't work for us, that definitely don't work for the women of Africa. I also question debt resistance and what that means for us with our histories, with our context, in a way that can make Africa a rule maker as well. How brave can we be, and how collectively brave can we be as a continent to resist? As Sankara said, you know, if we don't pay back the debt, nobody dies. But if we try to pay back the debt, then definitely, and we're seeing it now, many of us die. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for your presentation. You've been spot on the issues of inequalities, issues of structural adjustment programs that largely affect infrastructure, user fee that affects women. And I mean, it can't be the case that the world can turn a blind eye to this. It can be that issues of women can be pushed on the side, because we know the critical role that women play in the economy. And therefore, as inequality continues to rise with the current debt crisis, it is very, very important that we must work together and come up with economic modeling that works for women. And therefore, it is a collective call, bringing on all stakeholders to be able to come together and look at these issues and provide the way forward. And at this point, I would really want to hear from Dr. Simon Githuku. Dr. Simon Githuku is a research and policy manager with the Kenya Association of Manufacturers. And I would want to just hear from Daktari what role the private sector can play in the resolution of Kenya's public debt crisis. Karibu sana Daktari.
Thank you, Valerie, for this opportunity and for Dr. Jaraba for the good presentation. I'll not talk about much about the public debt problem in Kenya, given that I participated representing Kenya Association of Manufacturers in the previous workshop, the virtual workshop that dealt in this subject in a deep manner. But back to your question about the role of the private sector, is that we know they play a crucial role in terms of job, and they also pay taxes. Manufacturers are estimated to contribute about 17.5% of taxes in Kenya, despite the fact that they just contribute about 7.5% of GDP. Agriculture contributes about 2.3%, and considering that's very low, considering that agriculture contributes about 35% of GDP. That shows that the form of enterprises such as manufacturers or the private sectors, they bear quite a huge burden, a tax burden. But I want to tie the role of the private sector with a subject I really like, and I think there is not much appreciated in policy discussions. I want to start by quoting a study by Clark, Lima, and Sawyer in 2016 on stages of diversification in Africa in a Journal of Economic Letters. And in that paper, they have said that Africa has been regarded as the biggest development challenge facing the world. I want to use the same analogy and say that the biggest development challenge Kenya faces is institutional problem. Add Kenya Association of Manufacturers and the private sectors have been advocating for conducive institutional environment and conducive
I think we lost Daktari. The technical team, can you help us here? Can we have the technical team help us bring Daktari back? I think he just left. He's been thrown out. I think he has network issues. As we wait for that to be sorted out, I just want to thank the presenter, the keynote speaker, Dr. Njaramba. I want to thank our able discussants, Mr. Tobias, Ms. Wangari, Ms. Crystal, and I think as we wait for Daktari to come back, we can open for question and answers to the presenters and the panel of discussants. And the participants will have 30 minutes to pose their questions to the discussant, and kindly just give us your name and let us know whom you are addressing the question to, and be very brief in your questions. And so I think with that, I will ask the technical team to help us get the questions from the participants, and we will take those questions as they come. You can put your questions up on the chat box as well. And if you give the opportunity, you can also speak directly to the discussant or to the presenter if your question is to whom it would concern. Technical team. I'm waiting for the technical team.
Valerie, can I propose that you just call out the speakers? Is there any reason we can't just proceed with the speakers and then listen to Dr. Gezuku after the plenary session?
I think we are done with our panel of discussants. Dr. Kizuku was the last one. And so we were supposed to go into the question and answer session. Before then, we bring in our honorable member of parliament, Mr. Shabir.
Yes, and would you wish for me to assist, or were you to manage the plenary for us, Valerie?
You can assist, Shiru. Thank you.
Okay, let me then do that. And thank you so much, Valerie and colleagues. Thank you for joining us. Apologies for just the slight technical mishaps. We'll improve as we go along. And I will then call out the names as I see them. I see Abraham Rugo, Dr. Abraham Rugo with IBP. They're also members of the Okoa Uchumi campaign and coalition. I see Kosgei Hezron, and I also see Brian Dirito. And I'd like to start with those three. Please ask your, open up your mic, give your response, ask your questions. Thank you. Over to you, Abraham.
Thank you so much. It's really a joy to listen in and learn quite a bit from all the presenters. I think there are two themes that I feel have not been touched, and I wanted to hear a comment from Tobias and from Jaramba, and maybe also from Wangari. The first one is the very unholy relationship between business and politics, which lies in the rent-seeking and corruption. We know very well that a lot of the debt, if anything we have heard about is to go by, that a lot of it is even procured without even clear clarity of where the money is going to be spent and all that. And it's because of this very interesting relationship that politicians are also involved in business. Also, some of them own the banks and that theme, I think, is an important one to bring into the discussion around debt, because then it means that sometimes debt is procured or could be procured without clarity of where the money will be spent. But the second one has to do with the very direct corruption. So over and above how debt is procured, the question of corruption, particularly when it comes to actually the spending of the money. We have a lot of focus on how the percentages and all that, but the governance of the proceeds of debt, I think, is a big question that I don't hear coming out. I'll be happy to hear some comments on that, because I think that's where the crux of the resolution of this matter in a big way also lies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abraham. Kosgei, please. Hezron, kindly ask your question. I think Brian Dirito, you can go next.
Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to question this. My question is to Tobias, and correct me if I'm wrong. I've seen that the interest for lending money to different countries, mostly in Africa, they are rated at about 15% and above. But when you go to countries like Europe and the US, it's as low as 3%. Does the IMF have different interests for different countries? when they are lending their money? That is my first question. And my second question is, you said that IMF lowered downgraded Kenya because of their public debt. And yet IMF and these lending institutions are seeing that we've been downgraded, and yet they are still giving us money, like lending to the country. Is this valid or is it political? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'll take another 3 hands, Jacinta, Joanne, and Dorothy. Jacinta, please ask your question, give your remark. Thank you. Jacinta, we can't hear you. Your hand is up. Joanne, please take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you very much to the speakers for the very enlightening conversations that have been going on in the presentations. So mine would probably go to both Tobias and maybe Dr. Njaramba, just to maybe seeking guidance on what strategy we should adopt in our borrowing, as far as maybe borrowing domestically and foreign is concerned. Sorry?
Sorry, I was just asking, no, that's okay. Please proceed, Joanne. Asking okay. Jacinta to hold on a little bit. Please proceed, Joanne.
Okay, so I just wanted maybe commentary on what they suggest the government should do moving forward as far as choosing to either borrow domestically or
Joanne, we seem to have lost you. All right. Okay, I think we've taken a few questions. Please let us proceed to the panelists, and maybe those questions can be answered in order, starting with Dr. Njaramba.
Thank you for the opportunity, and even for the presentations that have come up. And allow me just to revisit on the issue of domestic borrowing, because I think it ties again with Joanne's question. A case of domestic and foreign borrowing. Domestic borrowing, it is assumed that it's borrowing that is denominated in domestic currency. Whether it's a foreigner lending the government, whether it's a Kenyan lending to the government of Kenya, as long as it's denominated in Kenya shilling, then that one is taken as domestic borrowing. Now, the domestic borrowing agree fully that it can actually pose inequality problem. It can raise a major inequality question. Whether it has done so or not, I think it's an empirical issue. It needs to be established. But I feel that it could have actually contributed mainly to the inequality, because those that actually give government money by domestic lending, then they are paid back because the government has to attract that finance through raising interest rates. So it's possible to do that. On the question whether it has actually crowded out, that one has been shown so far, it could not have done so, because comparing two regimes, that is 2002 to 2013, when interest rates went up to around an average of 25%. The banks were even more lending to private sector even than the public sector. The interest rate was at its highest. But coming to 2013, even at point when the interest rate had to be capped, it had to be pegged to CBR. And even after removing the capping, you find that the interest rate has remained largely below 15%. And therefore, we say that we need to focus on a different area on why private sector is not borrowing from the commercial sector banks. And you find that mainly it's on return on investment rather than the crowding out. So I wanted to bring that focus. And that's why the study really went more on to the foreign debt, because it is the only debt that poses a major risk in Kenya. Not that the domestic debt cannot, it has also the potential of posing maybe instability in the economy. But if it is prudently used, then it also promotes maybe a more of saving, because if private sector is not saving, you realize that of course the public sector through that concept of rewarding to those that intend to save, then it can promote the saving. But in terms of its impact into the domestic market, it has not been seen to really have had much issues. To also the fact that this is this money circulating. Remember, the currency that is in Kenya shillings, it is in terms of monetary policy employment by the government having the capacity to either stimulate the economy by borrowing or directly by printing money. In the event that there is a currency risk, then the public sector, the government can resort to printing money, but that cannot happen if it is a foreign denominated currency. It can only be paid by actually stimulating the market being more productive, and actually being productive by supplying to foreign market in order to pay foreign debt against the domestic debt. But the domestic debt as well could pose a major issue when it comes to distribution. Now, on the question of from Abraham, the relationship between business and politics, I agree. There is a major issue, and this is a question probably outside the debt question, but the relationship between politics and business is an area that Kenya needs to pay major attention. Looking at politics from the aspect of politician in parliament, those in parliament, we gave, of course, through our the review of the constitution and all that, the politicians do the planning in Kenya. The politicians do the budgeting. The politicians implement. And again, these are the same people we expect to do an oversight role. I think here, without doing much, probably I'm not qualified in this area, but I agree that there is quite a major issue. The people who are supposed to oversight, they end up oversighting themselves. I've been in the government, and I would say that there was a time that we had an issue if you could encounter an audit query. Nowadays, we no longer hear audit queries because the audit is queried on the same person that is supposed to make a decision on what will be the repercussion on the same query. On the issue of unplanned and, of course, unclear debt procurement, that one has been captured by the report, including the presentation I've done, that most of the debt that is acquired is quite disharmony between the budgeted debt or the debt financing and the actual. That difference needs to come out. Where is it coming? And is it actually even legal? The other question, of course, from the IMF and the World Bank, and also the foreign acquired debts, they have been unclear in terms of communication. What is it required? Does that law naturally adhere to the planning and the budgeting in the fiscal year? Then again, also, if you look at most of the documents and the agreements that we receive from the donors, they are not that reader-friendly. It's not clear in terms of language. And at times I feel that, of course, this could be the objective, that it is not communicating to a normal reader, so that probably it remains like that unquestioned. Now, from Joanne, what strategy in foreign exists in terms of foreign and domestic debt? The question never came out fully. I think it's the issue of how to reduce it and use the use of the same resources. Of course, from the standing that, of course, there is of course, a position that public debt in Kenya, it's the high time it's reduced. How to reduce that? Of course, the study gave suggestion in terms of one, prudent use of resources. That is the question of corruption, the question of allocation, optimal allocation of these resources must be demonstrated. Then, of course, it should not go to recurrent expenditure. That has been noted. Again, now, once it comes to the question of planning, I agree and look forward to a time when we will adhere strictly to a fiscal plan, the plan that is done prior and of course used for purposes of budgeting is strictly adhered to, and anybody deviating from it, of course, it is either clear or answerable, because it is simply against the principles of planning and even against the Kenya written laws. Thank you so much. Back to you, Wajiro.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaramba. I'd like to request Tobias to give his response. And I'm afraid I'm not able to direct any questions. We received a few, but maybe you can give your reactions to any you feel have touched on you. Maybe the discussion around the domestic and the external debt is one that we may not exhaust here. You can maybe give a final thought. I think Crystal also brought up some very fundamental points around the neo-colonial roots of the interventions around the fiscal consolidation. And in fact, she even went as far as saying around the SDGs. So I think very provoking and important questions, and feel free to respond to any other issues that have come up, including the corruption one. Thank you.
Thank you, Wajiro. So maybe I'll try to address some of the questions that came from the audience. I noted from Abraham, from Brian, from Jacinta, and I think there was also a question in the chat from Aaron. Let me take those a bit in reverse order. So Jacinta had a question on what's the recommended strategy for borrowing domestic or foreign. So I think a point to make there is that different types of borrowing have different types of risks associated with them. We've had some discussion of domestic versus foreign, and I think there are certain trade-offs, but overall, I think it's a question of trying to build a borrowing plan that meets a certain borrowing requirement in the least risky, least disruptive way. And principally, I think one would need to look at the most expensive types of debt, the ones associated with the largest risks, and seek to minimize those. So external commercial borrowing, try to move away from that, minimize it, rely more on concessional financing, rely also on domestic sources to the extent that concessional financing is not available, but do so within limits, within the capacity of the domestic savings and financial system. So I would think about it in that context. There was then a question also, this was from Brian, on the interest rates that the IMF charges and whether we discriminate between countries. So the answer is no. We apply the same interest rate to all countries for our standard facilities. These are quite low. The effective cost is an interest rate of around 1%. We then also have special facilities for the lowest income countries, which have concessional terms attached, and the interest rate there presently is 0. But the principle is that the terms are the same for all countries that qualify for a facility. So there is no discrimination between countries, and the costs of IMF borrowing are far below what, for example, you would see with going to the external commercial market or Eurobond or such. And then lastly, to the questions on, well, sorry, before going there, there were two questions, in fact, on why would the IMF lend to a country that is in high risk of debt distress or has been downgraded. So one, the IMF is a global organization representing membership that is comprising almost all countries in the world. Our mandate is to help the members. So we do seek to assist countries. But we are also a lender, and we provide loans when we have assurance that those loans are being well spent, that countries will be in a capacity to pay back, that debt is sustainable. So that's also where countries' economic policies, where the economic plan of a country, where the program that the IMF funding is supporting, where that is so important. It's essential that there is a strong plan, that if a country is at high risk of debt distress, that there are plans in place to address those risks, to reduce debt vulnerabilities. So we do lend for countries where debt is sustainable, but it is important that there is a framework that assures that. Then to Abraham's question and others also on the importance of rent seeking and corruption, all the negatives associated with that. I think no agreement there, or disagreement, sorry. I think everybody appreciates that this is absolutely essential. I would take it further than just being related to debt. I think questions of whether public funds are well spent apply across the board in any type of government spending, any type of government activity. As a consequence, structures relating to transparency, to accountability, to ensuring good governance, to ensuring that proper procedures are being followed are so important. In the IMF program, you will see that there is a lot of focus on questions of governance, of fiscal transparency. This is an area that has become, I think, even more into focus following the COVID shock, as more money is being channeled in very quickly to provide support in these areas. It's also necessary that there is accountability in the use of the funds. So, for example, one of the structural benchmarks in the program was to undertake thorough audits of all COVID-related spending. We have also a number of other measures relating to fiscal transparency. So there is reporting on pending bills of government. There is reporting on public tenders, providing information on who is winning these tenders, what are the terms. We have a structural benchmark for tax expenditures, meaning what are tax exemptions and incentives that are being provided, what are the details around that, what are the costs. So fiscal transparency, I think, is a key step in terms of ensuring that there is greater visibility into what governments are doing, supports accountability, supports ultimately that there is more value for money, that funds are being spent appropriately. So absolutely no disagreement with the importance of that.
Thank you so much, Tobias. And I'm going to ask because I need to give Wangari the opportunity to respond, and Crystal, I'll request that you be very brief. We've got a bit of a time crunch, and we'll, so just keep it as brief as possible so we can take one more round of questions, and then we'll go into our second session of the day, and still try and finish by midday. So please keep it brief. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'll be quite brief. There was a question on policy and what the government should be thinking in terms of debt levels and how to think about debt. And I think what we found in our paper is that with the relationship between domestic debt and private investment, is that anything, if you have annual domestic debt that is under 3.72% of GDP, then there's an opportunity for the government to crowd in some more investment up to that point. Anything above 3.72% will start to crowd out investment. So I think if there's any policy that the government should be looking at, and this is looking at historical data and applying that to statistical analysis, anything above 3.72 starts to crowd out private investment. So that is a clear policy that can be communicated. To Abraham's question on corruption, I think we are starting to see some sort of innovation, I think, when it comes to corruption, and I think this is also alluded to by Tobias, in terms of looking at our expenditures and even looking at our budgets, because now we're starting to see budgeted corruption, where the corruption is actually built into the budgets, and so there needs to be some additional. And I know, Abraham, this is your area at the IBP, a real strong analysis into the budgets, into what figures are being put against what items, and if those items are realistically budgeted, and that also then aligns to expenditures, and seeing, in our reports, what has been financed and have those items, goods and services that have been expended against actually been delivered. The government is trying to do some things to ensure that budget corruption or corruption on the whole is being curbed. There are two things. One is the revised standard chart of accounts. Recently, we were engaged with the National Treasury and the stakeholders to revise the standard chart of accounts. It's going to be, the standard chart of account is essentially a code, financial transaction coding that's input into IFMIS that tracks each and every financial transaction within the government of Kenya. And any amount or any shilling that goes into the government system should be able to be tracked through the standard chart of accounts. So for example, if money is coming from IMF or through the concessional borrowing, the Eurobond, whatever, we're able to track that through the source of fund coding and essentially track which amounts, which monies that have been provided or generated by the government have been used against what items. So that is something that the revision of the standard chart of accounts should be able to help with that. And then finally, with the control of budget, we're supporting the control of budget to develop an online electronic tracking system, and through which this system will be able to, track financing. If financing is being requested by any government, the request, as you know, government's requests for release of funds through the control of budget through the system should be able to track the projects and do randomized visits and an evaluation on whether the funds that have been released have been used against what has been requested for. As we know, sometimes in some governments or in some situations, some money is requested for specific items, and when the money reaches the accounts of those governments, those finances are used for different things. And this controller of budget system is going to help with the controller with its oversight role to ensure that the money is used accordingly. And the last point, there's a question of why does the IMF continue to finance Kenya? I think the question is really for the Kenyan government, because the Kenyan government is running a deficit and we have to plug that deficit. And our options are to who do we borrow from? And if you look at the hierarchy of which is kind of the better people to, or the better institutions to borrow from, multilateral borrowing is at low rates. Sometimes it's even at 0%. We are a middle income country, so we are not afforded as affordable loan facilities as previously, but we're still in an area where, because we're a lower middle income country, we can still access some low interest rates. If then we go to bilateral borrowing, which is from the other development partners, including China, and then the kind of most expensive borrowing is for concessional, is from commercial borrowing. So I think as a country, we should look at this as in my view, it should be a positive thing. If we are going to borrow, we want to borrow from multilateral lenders rather than from commercial. The real question is, how can Kenya reduce the deficit so that we are not looking to borrow? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wangari. Crystal, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to steep conversations, especially about current economic context in our history. And as we all know, and I've spoken about this before, Africa went through a deeply violent and extractive colonial period. It's estimated that the slave trade alone accounted for over $60 trillion worth of an injection based on the current minimum wage of the US to the global North economies in the form of free slave labor that ostensibly fueled the Industrial Revolution, free labor to grow cotton and cane sugar for their calories and textile commodities. And so really steeping this conversation in that brings up a conversation about reparations and laying that over current debt debt issues and our debt crisis and our looming, debt crisis as well. From this, we can begin to see that for this hegemonic economic system to exist, something and someone must subsidize it. It continues in the same trajectory with women's labor subsidizing states, but also formerly colonized nations subsidizing a global economy. And I think it's important to remember that, and to remember that history continues to repeat itself. And if we don't learn from it, we continue to exist in the same extractive patterns. And so narrative for me is crucial to this conversation. And it's important to remember the power that it has. If you look at illicit financial flows, we lose about $100 billion every year through illicit financial flows as the continent of Africa. Now, 65% of that is through commercial activity, and only 5% of that is through corruption. So yes, does Kenya have a corruption issue? Definitely. Is it our only issue? Definitely not. And this begins to paint a picture in terms of gravity of leakages, right? If 65% of our illicit financial flow leakages is through multinational illicit financial flows, then we really need to be questioning the role of the global north presence on our continent and in our country. Taking from this, I think linked to the power of narratives, when we talk about transparency, when we talk about accountability, that does not only mean that it's us that need to be put under this lens of transparency and accountability. If you look at the corruption index, it will be red in the global south. But if you look at the tax haven index, it will be red in the global north. And that is where a large majority of our resources lie, through illicit financial flows, through transfer pricing. It's robbery of our continent, of our country, and putting this into perspective and being cautionary to not paint us as just corrupt nations that need to be guarded and trained and built in terms of capacity, in terms of corruption and transparency and accountability is, I think, something that we really need to be cautious of and really need to push back against in terms of making sure that we are, being the rule makers rather than the rule takers, I guess. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Crystal, and thank you to all the other speakers. And I won't try and wind up now, I'll try and do that later. And I'm going to ask Annette and Dorothy, I know you've had your hands up for the last long while, and I thank God it's technological, so it's not a physical hand that's tired. Please keep them up. I'll come back to you first, but I think because of time, it's very important that I give our next two speakers the floor, and then we'll take your questions. And there's also a number of questions that have come on chat so that we have one last round of feedback. So I beg that indulgence. And I then also beg the indulgence of Dr. Githuku and also Honorable Shakir, because I'll be asking you to please use 7 to 8 minutes to give us your presentations. That's less than the 10 that it would have been, just so that we can accommodate time. I think it's a very interesting conversation. All of us have said quite a lot. And I apologize for that, but please do accommodate us. So Dr. Githuku, thank you for coming back to us. Please take the floor. And as I've requested, let's keep it to 7 to 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajiro, and my apologies. I have had internet outages, but nonetheless, I recap to the point I was trying to make that with regards to this topic, the role of the private sector and the debt problem in Kenya. And from where I sit, the private sector has been doing its job in terms of creating jobs and paying taxes, among other development usefulness to the country. But I said we have to address the root cause of the problem in terms of the debt. And I had started making my presentation by arguing that the biggest development challenge that Kenya faces is institutional, and which is mainly in 4 facets: governance, rule of law, and business environment. And all of these affect how the private sector functions, and whether because the private sector is there to make a profit out of the engagement they are in, including the manufacturers. For example, the question of the business environment, the taxation problem, which is increasing. And I can say that when a country gets into a debt problem, we cannot tax ourselves out of that problem. The other important question is regulatory environment. We have many overlapping mandates of institutions, and this needs to be addressed. I just want to quickly, so that we can have an appreciation of the institutional problem, quote a study by Asemoglu, Galejo, and Robinson in 2014. And they say that 75% of the variations in incomes witnessed in the world can be accounted for by differences in institutional quality. I can say that 75% of the development challenge Kenya is facing has to do with the institution. Hosman and Roderick in 2003, they said, with the improved governance, economic growth will follow naturally. And economic growth is beneficial to everyone, including the private sector. I want to quote another study by Roll and Talbot in 2001. They said, once a developing country government establishes the rules to a fair game and ensures their enforcement, it will be well advised to start back and enjoy the self-generating growth. So if we fix the institutional problem in this country, everybody, including the private sector, is going to flourish. The politicians, they are going to benefit because they will be impactful in their own capacities. I want to make reference to a few economic development challenges that Kenya has been grappling with since 1963. Health, poverty, food and nutrition, including the debt challenge, corruption. All these are symptoms of, to me, they are symptoms of the institutional problem. For example, the debt problem. How are our oversight mechanism? Where is the money going? All these things are dealt with by institutions. Even though, even though treating the symptoms is useful, more important is treatment of the root cause of the problem. If Kenya is to make any headway, then we have to address the institutional problem. Unfortunately, this problem seems not to be appreciated by politicians and policymakers. And related to that, I wish to make a strong statement. If this challenge is not addressed, no amount of taxation of private sector will work. We'll still be dragging and singing about the same problems all over again. You cannot tax yourself out of this problem. Institutions is one of the most important pillars for sustainable economic growth and development. You can imagine a house without pillars, it cannot stand, including the occupants. And the occupants here, I want to refer to them as the private sector, for example, the manufacturers. If the house collapses, everybody, the household and the businesses are going to collapse. So this has to be addressed. And I know of the structural adjustment programs that Dr. Jaraba made reference to. And we know about, there have been some piecemeal institutional reforms that have been proposed. So we need to do 360-degree analysis of the institutional problem and have an action plan, probably a 5-year plan to address that problem. So from where I sit, what would I propose as the way forward? If Kenya is to come out of the debt crisis and also help the private sector in this country, we need to develop an economic recovery strategy plan. Because even at our own personal level, we know that debt is a cash flow issue. Taxation from the private sector is paying the taxes. So we have to come up with a stimulus program so that the private sector activities in this country can flourish. I'll give an example of the economic recovery strategy that was adopted by the government in 2003 to 2007. The economy registered massive growth, 7% before the post-election violence of 2007. And it is during that year that Kenya manufacturing sector recorded the highest GDP contribution since independence at about 12.79%. So that is what we need now. And in its design, it has to have stimulus. We need to inbuild stimulus program. So what I mean is that when designing this recovery strategy, it should also be designed as an economic stimulus program and primacy given to this problem of institutions. So those will be my remarks, that let's deal with the root problem of development challenge that Kenya is facing, because the private sector is doing its job. Let's deal with the real problem that the private sector contribution cannot help to overcome. Thank you. Back to you, Ajira.
Thank you very much, Dr. Giduku, for being that clear and that concise. And I'd now like to welcome Honorable Shabir, who's with us as a member of the Finance and Economic Committee. He's also the chair of APNAC, which is the Association of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. And he's been a very good ally of civil society and continues to be that as he joins us here. So Honorable Shabir, kindly take the floor. And like I asked, please, I know you're a politician, and usually they say with politicians, you expect a very long speech, but I will ask, put on your civil society ally hat today, and let's please keep it brief for us. 7 to 8 minutes, I request. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Okay, firstly, you should know me, I don't speak much. Now, firstly, I'm very pleased to be part and parcel of this particular activity in the workshop. I have been following it since 9 o'clock, and I'm very very happy to get the comments and to see that the very insightful discussion that has taken place. Let me go straight to the issue of budget, public debt office, and where we stand on this issue. You want me to start my video? Sorry. Okay. Okay, there we are. The first point is that over time, we, as APNAC, as the African Parliamentarians Against Corruption, we have been talking about governance, and we've been talking on the Public Finance Management Act and the shrouded secrecy of the budget. Now we go back to the budget since 2010 to, in the 10th Parliament and the 11th, before in the 10th Parliament when I came, I found budget 3 days or 4 days before the budget was to be read, about two feet of documentation, and you expect it to go through. Now that whole thing has changed by the Constitution. Public participation is a must, but that public participation in budget, making the budget policy statements and all this, it's not just budget making. It starts. We've started now for the other budget in 2022. So I think it's very important that civil society and the public, and we be transparent. Public participation must take place at every level. And how do we do this? We need to keep raising our voice. You as civil society, us as APNAC being the African Parliamentarians Network Against Corruption, what are we? We are a number of current members of parliament through various committees. So we are your link to the various committees. So when you have a problem, APNAC can cross all the committees, and we are a recognized caucus, and we have our own status with the committees. So we are here to help bring some sort of transparency, some sort of governance mechanism, some sort of reporting systems. I am shocked. I've been in the finance committee now for 15 years, and every time I hear there's a new version of the Eurobond, now we're in the fourth issue of the Eurobond, and we're still stuck on thinking of the first one. And if we ask the general public, nobody knows about the second and the third and the fourth. They only know of the first one. As we're saying, I think what Okoa Uchumi is doing, and what civil society and you're all doing, is preparing a platform, a public platform. Do you know that I went to the public debt office in 2010? I've been there many times since. It is in a corner, and the office, the director is somebody they don't want. You know, when they don't want somebody, they send him down there, and they get nothing to do. And the poor guy the director has nothing to do with a small corner downstairs on the first floor. We have been working on the issue of public debt autonomy, and you mentioned that this was a private member's bill. Yes, it is a private member's bill. It is one that we as APNAC have been pushing. So you understand that we as members of parliament can also bring private members' bills. And APNAC, together with our partners in civil society, help us look at certain elements, and then we find suitable members of parliament who are actually keen and knowledgeable and want to bring forward a private members bill. So the private members bill is there. It's not just look at it as something that has been brought in, and we are now taking it and pushing it at every level. We want the debt management office to be autonomous. Under the PFM Act, actually, under one of the sections in the PFM Act, it actually stated that the Treasury, the Cabinet Secretary of Treasury, should give a letter of autonomy every term to the Public Debt Office. But it hasn't been the case. In England, that happens. We are trying to delink the Public Debt Office from the Treasury. Right now, it is shrouded in secrecy. The way things are borrowed, even as a finance committee, we only hear after the event. And then they start saying, oh, we made this mistake, or we did that mistake. We are very enthused that the public even went to demonstrate or object to the IMF and the World Bank on the last issue, the last request for credit. That has brought a new dynamic into play. That is the platform that we wish to work for. Us as the Finance Committee, and I speak on behalf of the Finance Committee and APNAC, we are convinced that the debt management office needs to be autonomous. It has to work on the management of debt, administration of debt, go and seek out the best options of debt. We want a director who is responsible directly, and the reports are coming to Parliament on a monthly basis or whatever. Right now, if you go to the budget for public debt office register, I as a member of Parliament, took me nearly 2 hours just to get something that was 2018. And I was a member of Parliament, and I was insisting. Now, how do you think the public can get this if we can't get it? And when you look at it, it is a shocker. There is no information as to what debt it is, what the rates are, what is being used for. So we are asking for transparency. And we want also in transparency and governance, this to be working in together with the public. We have a parliamentary budget office. The parliamentary budget office is also a key a key office, a key unit in our parliament that will be able, that gives us alternative budgets, alternative scenarios, and other issues. Do you understand that when the budget policy statement is put through, people don't really think it's something, but that's the beginning of unquestioned borrowing, you know, and we feel that this and supplementary budgets and are something that we would need to put an end to. Supplementary budgets are fine. Then there is a question of ceilings. What ceiling do we use? Somebody says, no, we are well to do. You can see that Japan is using over 100% of the of the GDP, nominal GDP. We are 70%. No. Are we there? Are we repairable? Can we repay? Have we got fiscal repayment capacity? So those are the things that the Finance Committee and the Parliament needs to oversight. And my predecessor has shown great concern as to the level of corruption and budgeted corruption. I agree that is one of the major issues that we have. Budgeted corruption. Corruption is budgeted for way in advance. Now, when you're talking about even the roads to the airports, even the railway, this was budgeted corruption. What we also need to know, up to date, we have not found out, and nobody has mentioned it. Where does the Eurobond fund go? What happened to the first one? Because we made so much noise about the first one, the second one is a little bit more transparent. We don't know. I mean, I'm telling you, as a member of the Finance Committee, I am not aware. I was only told the other day, oh, by the way, we are just going to get another Eurobond. So then I have an objection, of course, to IMF and World Bank. And the director has been very clear. They're a bank. They are lenders. They lend to make money. They are not all. They may be what you call have some sort of other secondary reasons, like improving the life of others. But these are lenders, and lenders are like Shylocks. They take advantage of our public debt situation. Then the other question that we have, and I want to direct this at the director there. Why is it that you will not even communicate with the legislature? You keep away from politicians, you keep away from the public, you keep away from the transparency. If you go to the IMF, we cannot even get details on IMF recorded. What is our debt? I was a banker. Before we lend to somebody, we have a complete portfolio of that person, who is borrowed from, where is borrowed from. We have a credit reference bureau. I'm sure IMF has it. We tried in the 10th Parliament. They did come once every 2 months or once every 3 months. They faded out because they work hand in hand and in cahoots with the government and with the Treasury. The Treasury have the mandarins. We even call them the mafia. And sometimes because if you do not control them, then they know that they are not under oversight, even personal oversight. They can do many things. They can destroy, and they can lend, and they can borrow, and then you only hear about it when they bring it to Parliament and say there's nothing we can do. So, from my perspective, and from the perspective of parliamentarians who want to get to the bottom of this issue, we are very pleased that, and we want to encourage this platform, a second platform that Okoa Kenya brings in with the public participation, and that will be a platform that can also have an effect, or can also have an input to the World Bank, to IMF, and IMF and the World Bank must listen to the three platforms, legislative. Of course, judiciary doesn't come into legislative, and the executive, and the public. Do we need that debt? How do we want to do that debt? And one of the issues that we're still talking about is, you remember there was a time, I think, our domestic debt rate of Treasury bill had gone up to 75%. It's ridiculous, 75%. But we survived, and we went through. So we need more transparency. I know I've sat with TISA, I've sat with the Institute of Economic Affairs. We've had little meetings, and what we are trying to do is make a little impact, make the small impact that we can. Let's continue to do that. I'm sure, like Wangari Maathai said, little at a time. Let's do the best we can. We are coming to the end of our term as parliamentarians. We hope that by that time, we have put some sort of a basis of a public platform. So you're no longer seen as irritants. You know, that we don't see the social society as irritants. That is where we as APNAC have put our major impetus on, and our major concentration, that we work with civil society, not to become civil society, but to listen to civil society, pick up what we can. They can also come to us and tell us this is what we want. One of the other things that we are trying to look at, for those who want to be concerned, lobbying. You know, there's a lot of corruption, as you say, brown envelopes pass here and there in Parliament. But in the USA, it's lobbying. Therefore, formalize some of these things. So we're looking at that sort of issue, and we are looking also, when we are coming, the Treasury must become more transparent. Presently, the Treasury decides they are the gods, and they decide who's going to get what money and whatever. It's a budget. Once you've set up the budget, when you've agreed, so much must get that money. It's the job of the Treasury to do that. They now no longer are policy makers. They are now cashiers. So the cashier they're going to get the money and give it out. And they're not there to go for borrowing and without unsecured borrowing, and borrowing without any transparent reason and without the authority. That's the new act. The new bill requires any major borrowing to come through to Parliament, and it to be approved by Parliament. We're not making it a very long system, but we want to have some sort of correction. And we also want the public debt management, public debt register to be transparent, to be on the internet, so that anybody can raise it, and it must be current, like our accounts. I think I will end there. For those who are giving up, those that show concern about corruption, very much there. We are very much with you. We are working on it slowly. And of course, we are never going to solve the problem without the civil society and others bringing out. Thank you very much, Wanjiro and your team. I appreciate and I look forward to this. And those who are, we also putting together another meeting, I think, with Wanjiro, that was trying to get hold of you on the 15th of September with the parliamentarians, APNAC, and the civil society to talk about a number of these issues. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Honorable Shabir. Thank you for those many remarks. And because of time, I'll move straight into the Q&A. And I can see Annette has her hand up, so she'll go fast. I had seen there were some other hands that have now gone down, and I'll assume that those speakers are no, maybe those issues were addressed. I have seen Brian has also put up his hand. I'm also going to ask Emily to read out, after Annette has spoken and Brian has spoken, Emily will then read out some of the questions that we picked up on the chat, and we will then have a last round from our presenters. So Annette, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Cheryl.
You're a bit low, please. We can't hear you so well.
Can you hear me now?
Much better, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much to the TISA team under the Okoa Coalition, and also to all the presenters for such an insightful discussion around the debt situation in our country. And mine is just an observation, and I don't know whether I might be wrong. I noticed that the research is delving or is looking more onto the economic factors in terms of influencing the trajectory of public debt in the country. And listening into different concerns, we look at the issues of corruption and all that. My thinking and just observation, and I was thinking that the social factors, the political aspect need to feature into this research, considering that the debt crisis actually in the country is as a result of the social and political factors. So maybe we have corruption, we have politics, we have the issues of social security. I mean, all those issues. So maybe as a proposal, if that is not done, that the social and the political aspects need to be dissected in terms of them influencing the public debt or situation in the country. Thank you.
Wonderful point. Thank you, Annette. Brian?
Thank you very much for giving me this chance. My question is directed to the Honorable MP. I've heard him say that he's in the Committee of Public Finance and we don't have the transparency issue. My question is, if we are borrowing money and it's not coming from the registration, from Parliament, they're not aware of the money being borrowed, who is borrowing this money? Because actually we have a case in court right now with the AG trying to hide the files for the SDR funds. And if Parliament is not aware, who gives the go-ahead for borrowing money? Is it the President, the Treasury, or who does this? Yeah, that's my question.
Good question, Brian. Thank you for that. Let's get Emily. Could you kindly share the questions that are on chat?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. So Sandra Misiribi asks, what happens when the government fails to pay its debts? For example, if we fail to repay our debts on the SGR, what will happen to Kenya? There's a question to Tobias. It asks, do you consider the current public debt before approving another loan? I think that was answered. Another question to Tobias is what is the IMF policy on consideration for a country to qualify for a loan, which is similar to the previous question. The other question is how does the IMF ensure that the borrowed money is utilized as required? I think a bit of that has been touched upon as well. Bishop Callistus Baraza asks, can financial institutions be requested to consider stepping in to salvage the nation from this danger? Andrew Miendo asks what Wanjiko can do to contain the external debt while making the government responsible. And then Reverend Titus Komora, still a question to the IMF, considering the pandemic, why is the IMF still allowing Kenya to increase her debt? Catherine Kihika asks if it's possible for Kenyans to request for accountability for those loans and also campaign to have industries that Kenyans can rely on and not specifically the IMF. Neston Joseph asks do you think increasing taxes will solve Kenya's problem of debt? And then some of the comments that are coming out from the chat. From Caroline Maina, she says the problem of the government is that they do not support local industries. The president is focused on political matters and not about the economy, and this is costing the country a great deal. Sandra Misiribi says the Kenya debt is high. It rises because of the high government salaries, uncontrolled borrowing and poor economic conditions and inappropriate fiscal policies. Aaron Marisoi says he hopes that Dr. Njaramba's way forward should also include mechanisms to curb corruption, which is really the monster in our economy. Another thing about corruption is from Emelda Ombese, who says corruption is a big pigment in our development society, in the development of our society, and unless we work on mechanisms of dealing with it, we will not solve the problem. Adrian Terry says, asks if the citizenry can be asked to vote or approve approval ratings, which will be publicly visible on deficit spending if there will be more need for external loans. And he suggests that it may start as a survey and later on morph into requirements in the law when the budget policy statement is being read in February. Brian Deritu says that it's a great insight that IMF is indeed a lending institution and not a philanthropic institution. I think those are most of the comments and the questions from the chat without repeating most of them.
Thanks so much, Emily. And I note, I'll seek to kind of just cluster them. And I urge the panelists to organize their thoughts in terms of way forward, because a lot of the questions that have been asked maybe had been addressed before. And the sense I'm getting is people, the people on the chat are looking for a way forward. So Annette, yes, the study focused a lot on the economic factors. There's a set of questions we had prepared. No, we were not looking at the social and political factors. And it's a good point that perhaps we now need to do another study that can address that. Much in the same way that possibly we now need to get into the corruption issue. This study was not focusing on that. We were really looking at the fiscal consolidation program, and we were looking at the underlying philosophy and the assumptions made, because we were saying we agree with a good number of the recommendations, but our concern is that unless we look at the underlying, as Dr. Giduku has told us, unless we get the philosophy right, as Crystal has told us, we will then be, at cross purposes. So I think those are areas for further study. Brian has asked a question to Honorable Shakir, which is how come Parliament doesn't know? And maybe Honorable Shakir, in your response, you'll just explain a little bit more what these gaps are, because there's a sense that Parliament has failed Kenyans. And so when Kenyans hear you saying that Parliament doesn't know, Kenyans are left wondering, then where do we go? Then there's a whole raft of questions directed at the IMF program, many of which have been addressed already by Tobias. I think coming from, to my mind, there's a need, there was a need for a proper sensitization of the public by the government of Kenya, because as Tobias told us, this is a program of the government of Kenya. The conditionalities come from the IMF, but the owners of this program is us. We want to be rule makers, not rule takers, but right now we are the ones who took the rules. So there's a gap of public participation, and our constitution, that implies an illegitimacy of the program. So I think, Tobias, maybe you can speak to that. How do we, what can the IMF do to sensitize Kenyans? Understanding you need to work with government and civil society, and how do you ensure that this program, that this 3-year program is legitimate and therefore will be successful? Otherwise, as Dr. Jaramba pointed out, as soon as the government has all the money, they'll throw out the promises, and already we are seeing that they are throwing out those promises in terms of the salary caps. Those are forgotten as soon as the ink is dry. Then the issue of political leaders has come in, the issue of corruption. I think one of the most proactive way forward coming out of these questions is, do we need citizens to vote on the issue of deficit spending as part of the BPS approval process? And I think that is very innovative. And I'd like to throw that to the speakers. And so I'd like to open the floor to our panelists in terms of what they've heard, not to repeat what they've already said. We can't exhaust, there are numerous issues, and I'll do a brief recap at the end, but really to just say, what are some of your maybe 1 or 2 top recommendations for a way forward, that will go into our communique and into our roadmap work plan out of this discussion. So again, I'll start, maybe I'll reverse the order so that I start with Honorable Shakir in terms of the way forward. And so I reverse the order of the speakers. Honorable Shakir, over to you. Thank you.
Firstly, why does Parliament not know these things? That is the point. You see, there has been so much opaqueness there at Treasury that we have been trying to now break in. Even right now, if you ask us, where did the Eurobond funds go? You don't know. Yesterday, we were asking about the 15 billion of equity. You know, there are certain things that you must understand that people do not want you to have information. We have said to the Treasury that if you are not open with us, we are not going to work with you. So Treasury, you must understand their workers. Start my video, okay. The working of Treasury is like a mafia. Believe me, it's like a mafia. It's a Mandarins. They are very, very capable economists and very capable people who are suppressed. So what we are trying to do is that we need to give them a voice. We need to make sure. You see, when you're talking about the budget policy statement in February next year, very, very important that right now, the public, the civil society participation should be there, because you see, once the public policy statement is passed, and you know, nobody really understood what a public the budget policy statement did, and that really opened the door, the floodgates. And then once you now ask, why did you go and borrow? But he said, but you did approve the budget policy statement, and it's for us to see how we can do this. So yes, if the Public Debt Office was up to date, if it was autonomous in its operations, if it was effective, then we would have that information coming to us separately. But when nobody is going to send you information which is not going to help, which is going against their own operations from Treasury is not going to do that unless that there is this other body who says, listen, we don't know the intricacies of the policies, but this is what the public debt situation is. So Parliament has been blamed for this public debt. We have no knowledge of it. All it comes to us is to be approved. And the last time we approved it, then it said, we'll not come to you again. And they came with so many things. Do you know that Parliament is also lobbied? So even the Treasury and there was a time that the government would just say, this is it, we want it passed. And of course, if you go and look at the handset, you will see many people object to it. But in the end, we are talking about majority. What we are trying to do is to make Parliament, even if it's only 5 of us or 10 of us, is to make sure that somebody is putting an objection. So people start getting to know the general good, what is generally good for the public. The other issue, the way forward, this public platform must be strengthened. It should not be one that meets now and then because the TISA and IEA and some of civil society are getting together. I really do recommend that this should be the basis of some sort of public, some sort of platform where alternative views can be sought and where alternative views can be discussed and can be voiced. And this one, if it is there, like it started with the petition of the public, the Kenyans to IMF, let that be the basis of this platform. And let IMF and the World Bank know that when they are lending to any particular concern, there must be certain ticks and certain procedures that they need to look at and oversight and before they give the loan. And one of them should be, what is the public platform saying? Is it true what's been said? Is the government being open with us, or are we being open to the government? I've been to certain places on IMF. We have a parliamentary network platform with the IMF and the World Bank. APNAC and the worldwide body called GOPAC has questioned even the transparency of these two organizations in the projects that they have been involved in. We went, I think it was Peru, we went somewhere in Peru where they had told us what they had done, such great things. And when I was walking in the behind, as if I'd been left behind, the people came and told me, you know what they're doing is they only came and painted this 2 weeks ago for you. So I think once we are able to have a platform which is strong enough, then we, even as APNAC, when we are getting swamped in Parliament, we can even come over to you and talk about it. So I think, Wanjiru, you know, we have talked about this, and I'm looking forward to this public platform to raise an awareness with the public so that we are not parliamentarians are not just bashed all the time. We should be bashed. We should be bashed. But we also need to make some changes, and the changes that we should all demand is the Public Debt Office be made autonomous, full stop. And that's the way we need to move.
Thank you very, very much, Honorable Shabir. Thank you. I'd like to invite Dr. Geduku to give us a quick way forward, very quick. And first, I'd like to beg the indulgence of this meeting once again. Please give us an additional 15, 20 minutes to allow us to just wind up this session. I apologize for that. For those who have to leave, this recording will be available, but we ask that you do stay with us. So Dr. Geduku, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajiro. I think at the end of my presentation, I give a way forward. What I can add is we encourage the government to continue listening to the private sector, because the private sector is the wearer of the shoe, and they know where it hurts. And that is one of the ways to diagnose the problem. So let the government, including the legislature and all institutions, work with the private sector to take this country forward. Back to you, Ajiro. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Geduku. Crystal, kindly take the floor.
Yes. Thank you. I agree with everything Honorable Shabir said, and I second those motions, but also to renegotiate debt servicing for the future, which contain a maximum rate of debt servicing as a proportion to national budgets, I think is something that we need to look into, but also, and lastly, a gendered human rights impact assessment and fiscal policy instruments that have been selected to address the debt servicing cost. So making sure that we really know what austerity measures have as in terms of an impact on women specifically, but also as we take this debt, what does it mean? Because with the growing rise of public-private partnerships, it means, you know, profit really is at the core of those investments. If maternal health care isn't profitable, it's just not invested in. And so redefining what priorities are at the table when we're looking at what debt to take. Debt is not always bad, but the conditionalities that come with it, you know, the terms in which we agree to and how public it is. And so making sure that there's an enforcement that, you know, debt must be publicly declared in terms of how much we're taking, where it's going for, and what priorities, and what was the process behind taking on that debt.
Thank you very, very much, Crystal. Wangare, please take the floor.
Thank you, Wanjiru. Just a few quick remarks, and thank you very much for this excellent opportunity. So I think while external debt is growing at an alarming rate, we must not just look at the amount, but we also have to look at affordability, given the timeframes, repayment amounts, and what we are investing in. And I think that will give us a more rounded picture. The second thing I wanted to say is from an affordability perspective, domestic debt takes up a significant amount of interest rate payments, and while it's denominated in Kenya shillings, it is not guaranteed that that money remains in the economy because of the foreign-based investors that exist domestically. For government, let's start to take a more serious effort to reduce expenditures and not just look at the raising taxes. We need to analyze budgets. We need to analyze our financial statements and the output and outcome reports to establish our value for money and where the budgeted corruption lies. And then lastly, just reacting to Honorable Shabir's statements, I think for me it was quite alarming to see the limited capacity that the Parliamentary Finance Committee has to hold Treasury accountable, as this is one of the primary roles. And as they also represented people, I see a lot of comments saying that we need to pass it through public participation first before we pass any go into any debt. But that's also because the representatives represent the people. That's one of their primary roles, and not to reduce public participation, but how can we strengthen our own representatives in Parliament to hold Treasury accountable? And I think that is a key concern that I see coming out of this conversation, because they are kind of at the front lines when it comes to managing how our finances are managed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wangare. Tobias, over to you for the way forward, any other remarks you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Wangari. I think I'll not go back to any of the policy questions that we've been discussing, but more for the way forward in terms of engagement, how to dialogue on these important issues. I think a forum like this is so important. It's helpful for everybody to share perspectives and insights. And I wanted to also touch on the whole point of transparency again, and really just to say that transparency, as I see it, it cuts all ways. So certainly from the IMF side, that's also something that we are very focused on ourselves. I can tell you in response to some of the comments suggesting that perhaps there are some things that are not being put out in the open. All details of IMF lending are available publicly on our website. All documents that are approved by the board that relate to Kenya, all details of financial transactions, all terms of loans, everything is available on our website. Some of the information may be technical and hard to interpret, but we also try to make it publicly accessible. We've put out some frequently asked questions, answers to those, seeking to ensure that really the information is available and understood broadly. So to me, that's really a key, that to advance these issues, we have informed dialogue and that information is really flowing freely, and hence big appreciation for participating in the session today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tobias. Dr. Jaramba, over to you for the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. I think I must say that listening to Honorable Member of Parliament, Shabir, I must admit that my fear have been confirmed. I must look at the fact that the reason why we brought the Constitution, the new Constitution 2010, we removed the power of budgeting, financing from the Treasury, and we gave that to Parliament. The fact that the Parliament is out of touch with what is happening is really worrying. And therefore, I say that no matter the number of laws we will actually bring forth, we will still be talking about the same problem. Let's make our members of Parliament accountable to the voters. And of course, there was an issue I wanted to look at of whether what would happen if the government defaults on paying the debt. And I say that it's only its credibility that actually would be affected. But of course, with some risk, especially on commercial related loans. Allow me to also conclude my comments by saying that Kenya is confronted with unproductive economy. Kenya is confronted with unproductive economy owing to import of everything, which is financed through borrowing. I repeat that Kenya is confronted with unproductive economy owing to imports of everything, which is paid or financed through borrowing. Looking at comments and the issue raised by Christo is that, of course, we have a number of leakages that are actually causing this. And by also borrowing from Dr. Giduka's wordings, that by taxing the country, we cannot then get out of the problem. By taxing the country in order to get away from the problem, we'll never get us out of this problem. There is a whole approach to this issue, and I say that IMF will not assist us. IMF or in introducing or bringing other structural adjustment programs may not actually take us out of the problem. And I'm saying this because Dr. Giduku has actually brought the economic recovery strategy in the year 2003, coming forward, which probably brought the economy into massive growth, including private sector impressive performance. I want to say that none of the economic recovery strategy was supported by foreign donors. Not IMF, it was not in any way anchored to any structural adjustment program. However, it reported an impressive performance in the economy. And therefore, my way forward is that can we borrow what happened in the introduction and implementation of economic recovery strategy? Thank you so much, Ajina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaramba. And I'll just beg the indulgence of the meeting so I can give just a broad wind up of what I've had coming out. And I'll start with that last point raised by Dr. Jaramba. And it was also raised by Tobias and by Dr. Giduku, that we need to look at the medium-term fiscal consolidation plan, how it feeds into the BPS, into the debt strategy. We need to look at the underlying, and this will enable us to answer questions about the external debt versus domestic debt, to answer questions about the tax rate, to answer questions about the monetary policy. So we need to get, first of all, into the plan, look at our assumptions, look at those proposals before we start, before we continue implementing, because we are saying our study is finding that the SAPs, the fiscal consolidation program, is not fit for purpose. Some things work, others don't. The second big thing is corruption, and the need for us, as Dr. Giduku told us, that it's about governance. It's about the institutions. We cannot tax ourselves out of the present problem we have. And Dr. Jaramba has brought it up at the very end, that we are dealing with really unproductive application of these unproductivity in our expenditure and also in our debt management, linked to this budgeted corruption. And we've heard from Honorable Shakir that this is a big challenge, even for the oversight institutions, and he's given us some strategies that we need to employ. Crystal also told us that around this, there's also the illicit financial flows that we need to be looking at. So and in fact, those also come under the plan, so that we put that on the radar. So we need to deal with the governance issues. The third issue is the narratives. And I'm very grateful for Crystal for bringing a very different perspective. A lot of the governance institutions that deal with debt work don't take the human rights or the social justice approach. We haven't had enough conversations about neoliberalism and its impacts on the policies that we are taking. And so the narratives are very important, and we have to unpack those. And Crystal gave us some very proactive way forward that we need to reimagine measures of growth, because GDP is not serving us. We need to do a human rights assessment of the impact of the debt expenditures. We need to go for debt cancellation. Again, this is a conversation we had at some point last year calling for debt relief. We haven't really engaged robustly in the debt cancellation. We need to revisit this, because it's coming out that we may need to go back and look at this issue. So that's our third issue. The fourth issue Dr. Giduku gave us was about the need for a 360. And as we say here, it's clear we don't do the 360 where we look at the financing, the expenditure, the systems, the public, we're not going to make it. The analysis, we need to push for a proper ERS. We have an economic recovery, a COVID economic recovery strategy. There's a document that was shared by the Treasury sometime in October, not validated, not clear whether this was ever taken anywhere. It didn't have the kind of analysis or depth that would be needed. So we need a proper economic recovery strategy to deal with this unproductive economy that will deal with the issue of access to vaccines. As Tobias told us, this is a priority, and we know it is. Access to vaccines, the stimulus that's needed for business. We need to focus on that 360 analysis and a 5-year plan. Then the last and very critical pillar, which I'm very happy to say was upheld just last week by the Court of Appeal as a critical pillar for any policy intervention when they annulled the BBI, was that what Honorable Shakir told us is that public participation must take place at every level. And so we need to get the public involved more effectively in the budget process, in the BPS process, which is starting now. Get the public to hold Parliament to account. And as Honorable Shakir is telling us, as they are engaging as parliamentarians, where they engage, they need to know that the citizens are watching them. So we need to look at our strategies, how we engage, how can we make Parliament more transparent, more accountable, connect them more effectively to the public through the way we work. So that's a challenge to us. An imperative for this program. And with those broad remarks, like I said, I assure you that the outputs of this meeting will be shared. This will be the recording coming out of this. And of course, there'll be a communique coming out tomorrow morning. There's also a feedback form that's been shared in the chat that we request you complete before you log off. I know you're always quick to go, especially when you've gone over time, but please do give us that so that we can improve how we work. My final point is to say thanks. Thank you to all the participants. We've had very good numbers. We were at around 240, and we held that figure now at around 270. That shows a very big interest, and we're going to continue driving to ensure that these conversations continue. And like we say, we want to build that awareness and agency. So thank you so much for all the participants, for the excellent questions, the very provoking questions that help us sharpen our thinking. Thank you so much to our speakers. I won't name you by name because we've all heard and seen you, but thank you so much for the time, for bringing your expertise, bringing your knowledge. I'll give a special thank you to Tobias for always being available, always ensuring that the IMF process is open to civil society. I think more needs to be done out of this. And as we've discussed prior, we will get back to you on how we can deepen these conversations. I believe we'll be reaching out to Wangare so that we can also work with her institution. It's great to have you on call, Wangare. We've been trying for a while. We know you're very busy, but we need to, we see between you and Dr. Jaramba, there is a tension. And possibly even if we drill down between Dr. Kiduku, there are different perspectives. These are all great Kenyans wanting to serve our country. We need to look at those points of difference and agree. What can we afford to disagree on, and what do we need to come together on? Because the debt mix ratio is one of those issues that is creating a lot of confusion. And also the monetary policy issue is one that has not had a lot of conversation, and we'll be calling on you, Wangare, to bring your expertise into those conversations as we engage with the IMF together with Dr. Jaramba and Kenya Association of Manufacturers in these conversations. Also, I'd like to say thank you to our funders, the Ford Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, Oxfam. Without your support, we wouldn't be here, and we really, really appreciate it. We do not take it for granted. And then to the TISA team. Thank you to the team that's organized this event. Thank you to Valerie, who supported us in the curation of this conversation and moderation of the first session. Thank you to our Okoa Uchumi partners, who are also experts in their various areas, and they support us. I think the job is much bigger than one institution. The job seems intimidating even when we sit as a coalition. But when we come together across the sectors, we begin to see that it is possible. So thank you for your time. I wish you a blessed rest of the day and a blessed rest of the week. And thank you. And we can close the meeting. Goodbye.